Hey now, NegroVMX here with another review of an off-the-beaten-path SNES RPG that I played through for the first time on Twitch. Treasure of the Rudras is a game by Squaresoft with a very interesting history. You see, after working on Final Fantasy VI, Square immediately started working on the next Final Fantasy game for the Super Famicom. However, the game that would become Final Fantasy VII wound up being cancelled due to the end of the console generation rapidly approaching, and instead they moved on to the PlayStation. No, it was never going to be on the Nintendo 64, that's an urban legend. Anyway, what's interesting about this is that they're two completely different projects. Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation used pretty much none of the ideas that came from Final Fantasy VII on the Super Famicom. Instead, the ideas were split up and used in 3 different games. 2 of them were on the PlayStation, Parasite Eve and Xenogears, but those mostly used stories and themes, while feeling very different from Final Fantasy games. The other title, Treasure of the Rudras, is Final Fantasy in all but name, and as I played through it, my chat affectionately dubbed it Final Fantasy 6.5. Treasure of the Rudras was also the very last game that Square developed for the Super Famicom. The only other Square game after that was Treasure Hunter G, which they only published, they didn't actually develop that one. There have been numerous translation projects for Treasure of the Rudras, however the one that I'm using is the only one that was actually completed from Aeon Genesis, and I played it on the Hygan emulator. Now, I do actually take umbrage with a few of the choices made in the Aeon Genesis translation, and more on that later, but it's the only complete translation. The most recent version of this came out in 2015, while other projects, they ended way earlier and none of them actually translated the full game, so while I have issues with the job they did, they're kind of the only game in town. Treasure of the Rudras is similar in a way to Live Alive. You play different scenarios with different casts, only this time they all share the same world and they're even happening at the same time. There are 3 scenarios to play through, and then after beating them, there's one last one to unlock to finish out the game. I have a lot to talk about with this one, so let's get down to it. I'll be rating Treasure of the Rudras on a scale from 1 to 10 in the following categories: graphics and presentation, music and sound effects, story and writing, gameplay and controls, and of course balance and difficulty. And as I feel I probably will have to point out every single time, a 5 out of 10 is not an unplayable game, it's an average game. A 7 out of 10 is not an average game, it's a good game. For graphics and presentation, it's easy to see that this was once a Final Fantasy project, as the graphics and presentation look like a slightly more advanced Final Fantasy VI. If you like the way that Final Fantasy VI looked, and let's be real here, who didn't, you're going to also love the way that this game looks. Aside from having a similar yet improved look in terms of the characters, enemies, and backgrounds, there's also a lot more color and animation than in Final Fantasy VI, with a few people who came by my streams thinking that it couldn't possibly be a SNES game, thinking that it was early PlayStation, mostly due to the detailed animations that the characters have. It's not quite as stunningly gorgeous as Trials of Mana, but it's very clean looking and wonderfully animated. The presentation is very much like the previous Final Fantasies, with simple menus and a HUD that is easy to understand, though it took me a little while to figure out certain things about the HUD. This was probably due to a lack of documentation, or rather an instruction manual that would have explained this. I mean, I guess I could have looked at the instruction manual, but I can't read Japanese, so it would have been pointless. Another thing that can't be understated is how good the enemy design is in this. It ranges from the typical fantasy monsters to crazy depictions of otherworldly deities with a lot of imagination and detail put into them. For graphics and presentation, Treasure of the Rudras gets a 10. For music and sound effects, the game also gets high marks. While the soundtrack isn't as good as Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger, it does have its own feel. Something that's unique to this game, and some extremely memorable songs. Sometimes the game almost sounds more like a Lufia game than a Final Fantasy game, and I mean that in a positive way. Each main character's chapter has its own feel and its own themes. Some of the songs, like one example being the boss theme in Rise's chapter, are absolutely amazing. Sound effects also help to flesh out the world, adding to the gameplay just the right amount. For music and sound effects, I give Treasure of the Rudras a 9. For story and writing, well, keep in mind that I'm using a fan translation, okay? The story basically goes that the gods created a race of intelligent creatures on Earth, and then 4,000 years ago, they wiped out the majority of them in an apocalypse. This happened 3 times already, with the mermen, the giants, and the Danan races all being reduced to almost nothing, and now it's humans that are in charge of the planet. The game starts 15 days before the next extinction level event, and the cycle will happen again. Most humans will be wiped out by a god called a Rudra, and a new Rudra will be born to create a new race. There are 4 main characters: Scion, a knight; Serlant, a scholar of magic; Ryza, the chosen one; and Dune, a thief. Scion, Serlant, and Ryza's chapters happen at the same time, and then Dune's chapter happens a little bit after that. So there's a lot of different ways to play this game that affect how you experience the story. Like me, you may choose to play, say for example, Scion's entire chapter first, and then play the entirety of Serlant's campaign, and then Ryza's, and then finally, of course, Dune's. Each of the first 3 main characters have their own cast of party members, and they will meet with the others at predetermined points in the chapter, and sometimes you won't fully understand a scene until you've seen it from both angles, which I think is a really cool idea. You could conceivably play the game sequentially, like play day 1 of Scion's chapter, and then play day 1 of Ryza's chapter, just do all the day 1s and then all the day 2s, and that might give you a different perspective on how things happen. However, that's not the way that I played it. The story in each scenario is very different, and they don't immediately intersect with each other. Scion starts out by exploring a tower where he loses 2 friends and his eye, replaced by a magic stone called a jade. He then seeks to avenge his friends' deaths and seek out what it means to be a jade bearer, while also looking for his long-lost mentor. Serlant is studying ancient runes with his apprentice when he gets struck in the head by a jade, although that actually kills him. Serlant actually spends most of his campaign dead, with his spirit hopping from body to body trying to restore himself to life. Ryza, who was born with her jade, is the chosen one, so she's off on an adventure to save the planet and also reunite with her mother, who left on a similar journey years ago, never to return. Dune, the thief, flits in and out of the other 3 scenarios, usually stealing important items out from under Serlant and Scion, and then of course you find out that he's actually giving them to Ryza because she's the chosen one. But in the end, Dune winds up being the main character who leads the other 3. This leads to there being a lot of characters. There's 4 main characters, and 3 of them have 3 companions each, so there's a total of 13 characters. And it's impressive to see that Square gave them all their own unique personalities, and they tried to flesh each one out at least a little bit. Not a single character in this seems wasted, with each one contributing to the plot in some major way, though the majority of them sadly won't come on the final adventure. As for the writing, well, going by the fan translation, it's quite good, if you're playing as Scion, Serlant, or Dune, that is. I did Ryza's story third, and I was immediately assaulted by thirst the moment I took control of her. Now, Ryza is hardly the only woman in the game, but for some reason, every male NPC goes completely batshit insane as soon as they meet her. At first I thought to myself, well, maybe there's some commentary here. As soon as I start controlling the female character, everyone's trying to sexually harass her. Maybe they're trying to say something about that. But the game takes it way, way too far. When a certain secondary character, who had been a sympathetic character in the other campaigns, suddenly announces to Ryza that he finds her just as attractive as he did her mother, who he knew in the past, and then he admits that he tried to sexually assault her mother on several occasions, only to be deterred by her powerful magic. I was so aghast at this sudden turn, not only for the game to actually go there, but to treat it as a funny moment from a character that never showed any signs of being a creep before. Well, after speaking with some people who played the game in Japanese, this turns out to be an invention of Aeon Genesis's translation efforts. They literally added a joke about sexual assault to the game for no real reason. This definitely tainted the experience of playing it, and while I can't hold that against the developers or the Japanese writers, it does color how much I want to recommend it to you. I mean, after all, the Aeon Genesis translation is the only option to play this game in English. There are a few other moments of writing failure, and they all seem to be just jokes that don't land. Such as Scion in the final chapter jokingly calling Dune a brazier blunter rather than a treasure hunter. And when corrected by Serlant, he says that Foxy, who is Scion's implied love interest, would agree with him, and then Scion and Serlant laugh uproariously. What? Did I miss the joke? Is there even a joke there? I mean, the characters are shown laughing, so something funny must have been said. It was probably funny in Japanese, but the translation comes off as a bunch of humorless incels inflicting their humor onto anyone who's playing it, and that really just sucks, especially since this seems like a really well-written game otherwise. I still really like the game's story and most of its writing, so how much this deters you from playing it is really up to you. For me, I gotta say that while the story is great, the writing, at least that of the translators, is a bit uneven at best. I give Treasure of the Rudras a 6 for story and writing. For gameplay and controls, there's a lot to talk about. At first, Treasure of the Rudras comes off like an extremely normal RPG that plays like Final Fantasy, but there are some differences. This is actually a turn-based RPG rather than being active time battle, but what's cool is that you'll notice these little diamond icons on the screen in battle. At first I didn't know what these were, but it actually shows you what order your characters will take their actions in. That's great for formulating strategies in battle, especially when it comes to healing. Another major thing to talk about is the way that the game handles magic. This is the game's biggest gimmick. In most RPGs, you learn spells either through leveling up, or maybe you buy them, maybe you learn them from NPCs, or maybe you use special items to make spells like the Magicite in Final Fantasy VI. In Treasure of the Rudras, any character can cast any spell at any point in the game as long as you have it in your spellbook and you have the magic points to cast it. You start with some basic spells that are already in your spellbook, and the entire party shares your spellbook, so if you add something to it, all 4 characters that you have can use that spell. Though, of course, aside from needing the magic points, the effectiveness is going to be based on their own stats. Some characters are just more suited for magic than others. That being said, while this is a game where you create your own spells, this spell system is kind of like a language that you can almost sort of learn. You use it to make the spells. For example, early on you learn that Ig is a basic fire spell, and Na is the suffix that makes spells hit all the enemies instead of just one. So you could create a spell called Igna to make a basic fire spell that hits all the enemies. As you play through each scenario, you'll learn more and more of these words, which are called mantras, either from mixing and matching previously learned root words, prefixes, and suffixes, learning them from NPCs, or seeing the names of the mantras the enemies use on you. What's really great is that you can just put any word you want into the spellbook and see what happens. Now, some English words even do things in the game, such as power up, raising the entire party's attack strength, but if you enter a word that the game doesn't recognize, it'll just have a random effect. Sometimes you'll get like a void spell that hits really hard, but maybe it costs a lot of magic, or you'll get a random stat boost, or sometimes just pure damage. But every word that you can put in has its own animation, even if it's just the actual word flying across the screen at the enemy, which is, by the way, hilarious. What's cool is, since you can play these stories concurrently, you might learn a mantra in one that is useful for another, or if you're playing them consecutively like I did, you might start each story by filling up your spellbook with good spells that you learned. Though you'll have to start with weaker ones that you'll have enough magic points to cast until you get to a higher level. This magic system is pretty mandatory. You have to use magic in this game. Even if you're going for a brute force approach, you'll want to power up a character like, say, Scion with attack up spells or guaranteed critical spells, and give their weapon an element that's opposite to the enemy's innate element. What's great is just how easy and intuitive it all winds up being, though there are a few mantras that are bugged and don't have the effect that they should, such as what should be a powerful wind spell might instead be a thunder spell. There's always an alternate mantra that you could use, and these bugs seem to be due to the game's system being changed from Japanese to English, and English takes up a lot more space. One very cool thing that the translation team did was they increased the character limit for spells. Otherwise, some of the best spells in the game would not fit in English, although there's still some that won't fit anyway. For example, the one very powerful fire spell that I used in the end was Kaki Ikteam. Changing the element to water, it would be Kaki Akuteam. For holy, it would be Kaki Soateam. However, if the root word is more than 3 characters, such as Sera for dark spells, Kaki Serateum won't actually fit. One last important thing to talk about, however, is progression. There are sadly a few game-breaking bugs in Treasure of the Rudras, all of which were present in the original Japanese release. Usually this happens when a character goes to a place that they're not really supposed to, which is odd as the game does encourage exploration. But sometimes if you go to a certain place too early, you can get stuck and break the game. I've also heard reports that after being Scion, Surland, and Rise's scenarios, that Dune's scenario just might not start, forcing you to go back to your saves and rebeat the final boss of one of the scenarios to trigger it, with one streamer that I know even telling me that even after rebeating all 3 bosses, the final chapter just wouldn't start for him. I didn't have this issue, but it's something that I've read about also happening to other people, and this could be devastating, as Treasure of the Rudras is actually a very long game. Interestingly enough, prior to me finishing it, someone in chat asked me what is the longest RPG on the SNES. I thought about it a bit, and I said that, discounting strategy RPGs that could take a long time depending on playstyle, it's probably either Final Fantasy VI, which isn't super long by today's standards, but was very long for the standards at the time, or it could be Dragon Quest VI, which I've not actually played on the Super Famicom, but the DS version certainly was very long. Treasure of the Rudras beats them by a bit. This is probably the longest playthrough for a SNES RPG, so losing progress at a late game or being unable to continue could be potentially devastating. For gameplay and controls, the game definitely loses points for having progression stopping glitches, but as long as you're aware of them, they're pretty easy to avoid. So just do a little bit of research first. But when the game does work, the game is super intuitive and it's fun and easy to understand. It should get a lot of points off, and I probably actually did take a lot of points off for game-breaking bugs, but I have to add a lot of points for the amazing magic system, so I'm going to give it a 7. For balance and difficulty, Treasure of the Rudras is a game that does not mess around, even for a moment. Comparing it to other RPGs at the time, it's an outlier. Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI were cakewalks. This has a difficulty more similar to, say, Final Fantasy V, though for different reasons. While Final Fantasy V was somewhat difficult, the solution was almost always to either be a higher level or to change your party's jobs into something else. With Treasure of the Rudras, while grinding to a higher level will certainly help you hit harder and take more punishment, no amount of level grinding is going to give you a guaranteed win against any boss. You simply have to employ strategy here. Understanding what order the characters go in, which characters should fulfill what roles based on their stats, and what enemies are weak to what elements is of vital importance. You are not going to survive long if you don't learn how to do these things. This is an RPG that is clearly aimed at people who already play RPGs, and for me, that's just fine. I ran into a few difficult patches, and I always had to apply what I had learned, whether it was tweaking my book of mantras, or equipping armor that has specific defenses against an enemy's attacks, or learning what weakness an enemy has and how best to exploit it. This is a game where you'll almost never be mindlessly pressing the A button to have all of your characters do a basic attack. Bosses in this game, not only will they hit you hard, they also have deep wells of hit points and will wear down your resources unless you figure out how to do a lot of damage to them. Is the game ever unfair? Well, at first I thought so. When I first started playing, I was Scion, and I ran into 2 women who just took me apart. The crazy thing is, even after leveling up, they still just took me apart, and this is a battle where you have a choice of either using only attacks or only magic, and the enemy abides by whatever rule you choose. So I thought I had hit a classic unfair RPG boss until I figured out how to hit them for a lot of damage. It's not that the game was unfair, it's just that I hadn't really learned how to play it yet. And no matter which scenario you choose to play first, there's always a wake-up boss pretty early on that'll force you to learn how to play smart. There's one boss that's so hard that the game treats you losing as part of the story. It's not one of those unwinnable bosses where you're supposed to lose, it's just that the game treats your loss as part of the story and the game just goes on slightly differently. Considering that you don't have to level up to learn spells and you can access any spell at any point just by typing it in, there's really nothing unfair in this game, just things that you don't know yet. So it's a challenge, but it's a very fair one and it's a rewarding game to finish. For balance and difficulty, I give Treasure of the Rudras a 9. So, with a final score of 8.2, Treasure of the Rudras is a great game, though definitely a game that could use a newer, less chud-like translation patch. Or maybe even a revival with an official translation. I mean, Square Enix gave us Trials of Mana on the Switch. There's no reason that Treasure of the Rudras can't be officially released after all these years, right? Excising the translator's whims and getting the game's original script shine, it would probably raise the score even higher. If you're looking for a great SNES RPG with a high level of challenge, this is what you want to try. Just be on your guard in Rise's chapter for all the weird incel you.